Imagine you're exploring a cave in ancient Greece, maybe 2,500 years ago. You're deep underground where the torchlight barely reaches, and suddenly your foot strikes something hard. You brush away the dirt and there it is, a bone, but not just any bone, a femur, a thigh bone. Except it's massive, twice the length of your own leg, thick as a tree branch, heavy as stone. Your mind races. What kind of creature was this? What walked the earth before us? And the only answer that makes sense, the only explanation that fits what you're holding in your trembling hands, is that once, long ago, there were giants. This isn't fantasy. This actually happened, over and over again, across every continent, in every era of human history. People found bones that didn't make sense, skulls too large, ribs too thick, and from these discoveries, from these moments of awe and terror, the legends were born. Today there are over 8 billion people on Earth, and scattered among them are thousands of stories about giants, not similar stories, not variations on a theme, but fundamentally the same story told in Greece and told in Japan, told by the Aztecs and told by the Vikings, told in the Bible and told in the oral traditions of the Paiute people of Nevada. Everywhere humans have lived, they've remembered giants. Why? That's the question we're going to explore tonight. Not with easy answers or conspiracy theories, but by following the evidence wherever it leads, through ancient fossil beds and medieval manuscripts, through medical journals and archaeological digs, through hoaxes and genuine mysteries that still don't have neat explanations. Because here's what makes the giant question so fascinating. It's not simple. It's not just myths made up around campfires. There's something real underneath all of it. Sometimes it's misidentified fossils, mammoth bones that look disturbingly human, dinosaur vertebrae that suggested creatures of impossible size. Ancient peoples didn't have paleontology. They had imagination and pattern recognition, and a desperate need to explain the inexplicable bones emerging from the earth. But sometimes it's something else entirely. Real human beings who grew to extraordinary heights because of medical conditions we now understand. Gigantism, acromegaly, genetic disorders that push the human body beyond its normal limits. Men and women who stood 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall, who were living, breathing giants walking among regular-sized people, becoming legends in their own lifetimes. And sometimes, just sometimes, the answer is that we don't really know. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all gathering around the same strange stories that have haunted humanity since we first learned to wonder. The journey ahead is going to take us places you might not expect. We'll stand in the valley of Elath where a shepherd boy named David faced a warrior the Bible says was over 9 feet tall. We'll examine the room in the Smithsonian where conspiracy theorists claim giant skeletons are hidden. Spoiler, it doesn't exist, but the real story is way more interesting. We'll meet Robert Wadlow, who grew to 8 feet 11 inches in the 1940s Illinois and needed leg braces just to walk. We'll explore the Cardiff Giant, one of the most successful hoaxes in American history, and ask why people wanted so desperately to believe it was real. We'll look at megalithic structures like Stonehenge and Baalbek, and wrestle with the uncomfortable question of why ancient peoples sometimes accomplish things that seem impossible, even with modern technology. And we'll sit with the folklore, the friendly giants and the man-eaters, the giants who helped humans and the ones who hunted them, the cosmic giants who held up the sky, and the earthy giants who taught us to farm. Every culture has these stories, and they tell us something important about the human need for wonder, for something larger than ourselves, literally. What this isn't is a simple debunking. Yes, we'll look at the hoaxes and the mistakes and the misidentifications, but we'll also acknowledge that the giant legends contain threads of genuine mystery, real fossil discoveries that confused ancient peoples, real medical conditions that created human beings of extraordinary size, real archaeological puzzles that still don't have satisfying answers. The line between myth and history isn't as clear as we'd like it to be. Sometimes the myths preserve memories of real things, distorted through centuries of retelling. Sometimes the history is stranger than the myths, and sometimes we just don't know, and that's okay too. So settle in, get comfortable. We're going to trace these shadows, these legends of beings taller than men, back through time to see what cast them. Some answers will surprise you, some will disappoint you, and some will leave you wondering, late at night when sleep is just out of reach, whether maybe, just maybe, there's more to the old stories than we've been told. The giants are waiting. Here's something strange. Ask someone from Greece about the old stories and they'll tell you about the Titans, massive beings who existed before the gods, who literally held up the sky and shook mountains when they walked. Travel north to Scandinavia and they'll describe the Jötnar, ice giants who lived at the edges of the world, being so large their footsteps carved valleys. Cross the ocean to the Americas, and indigenous peoples from Alaska to Argentina have stories of giant ancestors, enormous beings who shaped the landscape and sometimes fought against or alongside humans. Go east to China, and you'll hear about Pangu, the cosmic giant whose body became the world itself when he died, his breath becoming wind, his voice thunder, his limbs the four directions. In India, the Daityas tower through ancient texts, massive beings who challenged the gods themselves. The Maori of New Zealand tell of giant ancestors who fished up islands from the sea. The Aboriginals of Australia remember the giant beings of the Dreamtime who created the landscape and taught humans how to survive. Different continents, different languages, different gods, different creation stories, different moral systems. But somehow they all remember giants. This isn't a coincidence. It can't be. The prevalence of giant myths across virtually every human culture on Earth represents one of the most persistent patterns in all of human storytelling. Cultures that had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years somehow developed remarkably similar traditions about beings much larger than normal humans who lived in the distant past. So what's going on? Why does every culture remember giants? The simple answer would be that giants really existed, that somewhere in our collective past humans encountered beings of extraordinary size, and these memories persisted across millennia, encoded in myth and legend. And we'll explore that possibility, believe me. But first, let's look at what modern anthropology and psychology suggest about why giant myths are so universal. The first theory is developmental. Children literally live in a world of giants. Every adult towers over you when you're 3 years old. Your parents are massive, powerful beings who control your entire existence. They can pick you up with one hand. They can reach things you can't reach. They understand things you don't understand. They seem to possess almost magical powers. Now imagine this from an evolutionary perspective. For millions of years, human children have looked up at adults and experienced them as giants. This perception gets encoded deep in our psychology, in the oldest parts of our brains where childhood memories and primal fears live together. Even as adults, we retain these early memories of being small in a world of giants. Some psychologists think our giant myths are just these childhood experiences projected backward into history, transformed into stories about when the giants were real and we were all small and vulnerable. But that doesn't explain the specificity of the myths, because giant stories aren't just about big people. They're about beings who lived before us, who shaped the world we inherited, who often died or disappeared, leaving behind a landscape marked by their existence. This suggests something more than just childhood memory. The second theory involves the landscape itself. Early humans travelled constantly, encountering bizarre geological formations that demanded explanation. massive boulders sitting alone in fields, clearly carried from somewhere else, cave systems that seemed too perfectly shaped to be natural, enormous trees that would take 20 people holding hands to encircle, unusually regular hills that looked almost like burial mounds, but far too large for any human, and bones, enormous bones, mammoth femurs the size of tree trunks, mastodon skulls with central nasal openings that could easily be mistaken for single eye sockets, ancient elephant teeth the size of human heads. Long before modern paleontology, humans were finding these things and trying to make sense of them. Put yourself in their position. You're walking through a valley and you find a bone longer than you are tall, clearly a leg bone, but from something impossibly massive. You've never seen an elephant. Mammoths went extinct in most places thousands of years before your time. You have no framework for understanding what left this bone behind. The simplest explanation: giants, beings like humans, but much, much larger. This wasn't ignorance. This was rational thinking based on available evidence. Ancient peoples were incredibly observant, deeply knowledgeable about animal anatomy from centuries of hunting and butchering. They knew what bones looked like, and these bones looked like human or animal bones, just scaled up to impossible sizes. The giant hypothesis made perfect sense. The Greek historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, described how people in the ancient world would find enormous bones and immediately identify them as heroes from the Trojan War, or even earlier ages, when settlers in ancient Greece uncovered massive skulls with single central openings. They thought they'd found Cyclops remains. Modern archaeologists know these were extinct dwarf elephant skulls, where the nasal opening sits prominently in the centre of the skull. But without that knowledge, the Cyclops interpretation was remarkably logical. The same pattern appears worldwide. Native American traditions often located giant legends in specific places where large bones had been found. Chinese texts describe the discovery of dragon bones, which were almost certainly dinosaur fossils, but often got reinterpreted as giant human remains. Medieval Europeans finding mammoth bones declared them to be the remains of giants mentioned in the Bible. The landscape itself reinforced these interpretations. Someone had to move those massive boulders. Someone had to carve those deep valleys. Someone had to pile up those enormous hills. Regular-sized humans couldn't do it. Therefore, the work must have been done by much larger humans, by giants who lived in the age before ours, when the world was younger and beings were bigger. But there's a third layer to the giant myths that goes deeper than psychology or paleontology. Giants serve a specific role in human cosmology. They're boundary markers, transition figures, beings who exist between chaos and order, between the time before civilization and the time of humans. Look at how giants function in mythology. The Greek titans aren't just big. They represent the previous order of the cosmos, the way things were before the Olympian gods brought structure and reason. When Zeus defeats the titans, he's not just winning a battle, he's replacing one cosmic order with another. The giants have to lose so that human civilization can begin. The Norse Jötnar serve a similar function. They live in Jotunheim, at the edges of the ordered world. They're constantly threatening to break through and return everything to primordial chaos. The gods fight them not because they're evil, but because they represent the wild, untamed forces that civilization must constantly push back against. When Ragnarok comes and the giants finally break through, it means the end of the ordered world and a return to chaos. Biblical giants work the same way. The Nephilim appear before the flood, in the time when wickedness was great in the earth. They're markers of a corrupt age that must be swept away so something new can begin. The giants of Canaan that the Israelites must defeat represent the old order that must be conquered before the new order, the promised land, can be established. This pattern repeats across cultures. Giants are almost always associated with the old world, the time before proper human civilization. They shape the landscape, create geographic features, teach humans important skills, and then die or disappear, making room for us. They're the bridge between prehistoric chaos and historic order. This suggests that giant myths serve a deep psychological and cultural function. They help us process the vast stretches of time before recorded history. They provide ancestors, but ancestors different enough from us that we can understand ourselves as something new, something that came after. They let us look at a landscape clearly shaped by enormous forces and imagine agents behind those forces, beings that acted with intention rather than just blind geological process. And here's where it gets really interesting, because some researchers think these universal myths might actually preserve fragments of real human experience, not encounters with actual giants necessarily, but memories of genuinely significant events that got encoded in story form and passed down across countless generations. Think about it. Homo sapiens have been anatomically modern for at least 300,000 years. We've had language, culture, storytelling for a significant portion of that time. But recorded history only goes back about 5,000 years. That leaves roughly 295,000 years of human experience that exists only in archaeology and myth. During those unrecorded millennia, humans witnessed incredible things. They watched glaciers advance and retreat, carving valleys and moving mountains. They lived through the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose by 400 feet, drowning coastlines and changing the entire geography of the world. They saw the extinction of megafauna, the disappearance of creatures that really were impossibly massive compared to anything alive today. They also encountered other human species, Neanderthals, who were generally shorter than modern humans but significantly more robust, with bone density and muscle mass that would have made them extraordinarily strong. Denisovans, about whom we know less, but who might have had their own distinctive physical characteristics. Perhaps even late surviving populations of Homo erectus, who were indeed generally taller than early modern humans in some regions. What if some giant myths preserve distorted memories of these encounters? Not describing Neanderthals as giants in terms of height, but in terms of strength and physical power. Not claiming that other species were literally twice as tall, but remembering that there were other kinds of humans, different humans, who lived before or alongside us and then disappeared. It's speculation, of course. Tantalizing, frustrating speculation. Because we can't know what stories our ancestors told around fires 50,000 years ago. We can only look at the myths that survived, written down relatively recently, and wonder what real experiences might lie buried beneath layers of retelling and embellishment. But here's what we can say with certainty. Human beings across every culture have looked at the world and felt that something larger preceded them. Whether that feeling comes from childhood psychology, from finding mysterious bones, from needing symbolic bridges between chaos and civilization, or from dim racial memories of genuine prehistoric encounters, the result is the same. Giants are universal. So now the question becomes more specific. Among all these universal myths, are there places where the myth and reality might touch? Where the stories might have started with something people actually found, actually saw, actually experienced? Because some of those ancient bones, those enormous fossils, were definitely real, and some of them were definitely found by pre-scientific peoples who had to explain them somehow. So let's talk about what they found and what they thought they were seeing. Imagine you're a shepherd in ancient Greece, around 500 BCE. You're walking through the hills near Samos looking for a lost goat when the ground gives way beneath your foot. You stumble, catch yourself, and look down to see what you've stepped on. There, jutting from the eroded hillside, is a bone. But not just any bone. This thing is massive, easily the size of your entire leg, maybe bigger. You start digging, carefully at first, then frantically. More bones, a skull the size of a wine barrel, teeth as long as your hand, and right there in the centre of the skull, a single massive hole, like a giant eye socket. You've just discovered something that will change your entire understanding of the world. You found proof that the old stories were true. The Cyclops was real, except you haven't found a Cyclops. You found a dwarf elephant, a species called Elephas falconeri that went extinct thousands of years before humans arrived on the Mediterranean islands. But you don't know that. Nobody in your world knows that. The concept of extinction won't be understood for another 2,300 years. The idea of evolution won't emerge for 2,400 years. All you know is that the stories your grandfather told you about one-eyed giants who lived in caves and hurled boulders at heroes suddenly make perfect sense. Because you are holding the evidence in your hands. This is geomythology. The study of how ancient peoples interpreted geological and paleontological discoveries within their cultural frameworks. And it turns out that what we call mythology was often ancient peoples' best attempt at scientific explanation. They weren't being foolish or superstitious. They were being rational, working with the evidence available and the intellectual tools their cultures had developed. The woman who really cracked this field wide open was Adrienne Mayer, a folklorist and historian of ancient science at Stanford. In the 1990s and early 2000s, she started systematically comparing ancient myths about giants and monsters with the locations of fossil deposits. The correlations were stunning. Virtually every place in the ancient Mediterranean world that had a tradition of giants or dragons was also a place where large prehistoric animal fossils could be found. And not just found randomly, but found in ways that ancient peoples would have encountered them, eroding out of cliffs, exposed by earthquakes, uncovered during mining operations. The Cyclops connection is probably the clearest example. Dwarf elephant skulls have been found on every major Mediterranean island where Cyclops myths originated. Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, Malta, the Greek islands. These elephants had evolved in isolation, shrinking over generations due to island dwarfism, the same evolutionary pressure that makes island species smaller when resources are limited. But even as dwarves, they were still enormous compared to humans, and their skulls have one distinctive feature that would have blown ancient minds. The nasal cavity, where the trunk attached, is right in the centre of the skull. It's large, roughly circular, and positioned exactly where you'd expect an eye socket to be if this was the skull of a giant humanoid creature. Ancient Greeks weren't stupid. They understood anatomy. They knew what human skulls looked like, what animal skulls looked like. But this thing didn't match anything in their experience. It was roughly humanoid in overall structure, but scaled up massively. And it had that single central eye socket. What else could it be but a Cyclops? The mythology fit the evidence perfectly. And here's the thing that really shows how sophisticated their thinking was. The ancient Greeks didn't just leave these bones where they found them and make up stories. They collected them. They displayed them in temples. They treated them as sacred relics, proof of the age of heroes. The historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, describes numerous sites across Greece where the bones of giants and heroes were displayed. He mentions a 10-foot-long rib at the Oracle of Delphi, said to belong to a Titan. He describes massive bones at Tegea, supposedly from the giant Orestes. He talks about enormous skulls and thigh bones displayed in temples from Athens to Sparta. These weren't random claims. These were documented collections, what we'd now call museums, places where physical evidence was preserved and interpreted. The Greeks were doing paleontology. They just didn't have the theoretical framework to understand what they were actually looking at. They couldn't conceive of creatures that had lived millions of years before humans, then gone completely extinct. That idea would have been intellectually impossible within their worldview, so they interpreted the evidence through the only framework available, the heroic past described in their mythologies. The Chinese were doing the same thing, completely independently on the other side of the world. Traditional Chinese medicine has used dragon bones for thousands of years. Ground up and used in medicines, these bones were supposed to have healing properties. For centuries, nobody questioned what dragon bones actually were. They were just something you bought from apothecaries, probably from dragons, obviously. Then in the early 20th century, Western paleontologists started paying attention to where these dragon bones were coming from, and they discovered something incredible. The bone dealers of China had been systematically mining some of the richest dinosaur fossil deposits in the world. Those dragon bones were real. They just weren't from dragons. They were from dinosaurs, giant mammals, prehistoric reptiles. But again, the ancient Chinese weren't being irrational. They found massive bones, far larger than any living animal they knew. The bones were often found in remote mountains and caves, exactly the kinds of places where legendary creatures were said to dwell. Some fossils, especially from long-necked dinosaurs, even looked remarkably serpentine when partially exposed. If you encountered a series of enormous vertebrae snaking through a rock face, partially visible, partially hidden, what would you think you'd found? A dragon, right? The dragon mythology explained the physical evidence. What's even more fascinating is how widespread this pattern is. Virtually every ancient culture that left written records also left records of finding giant bones. The Romans collected mammoth fossils and displayed them as evidence of giants. Native American tribes across North America have traditions about giant creatures, and many of these traditions specifically mention finding large bones. In some cases, we can directly link these traditions to specific fossil sites. The Sioux have stories about thunderbirds, enormous flying creatures. The Black Hills, where these stories are strongest, are also rich in pterosaur fossils. Coincidence? Probably not. The Mediterranean region was particularly rich in these discoveries because of the geology. Lots of limestone, which preserves fossils beautifully, lots of seismic activity, which constantly exposes new layers, and lots of mining and quarrying, which meant ancient peoples were constantly encountering bones in the rock. When you're digging a foundation for a temple and you uncover the leg bone of a Deinotherium, an extinct elephant relative that stood 12 feet at the shoulder, you're going to have questions. And the answer isn't going to be, this is from an extinct species of elephant that lived 2 million years ago. That answer is literally unavailable to you. So you're going to go with, this is from a giant. And you're going to be wrong, but you're not going to be stupid. You're going to be rational within the limits of your knowledge. Picture what this must have felt like. You're living in a world where the oldest stories you know go back maybe 500 years, 1,000 if you're lucky. The past is already mythological to you, full of gods and heroes and creatures that don't exist anymore. And then you find this bone, this impossible, massive, undeniable physical object that proves the past was even stranger than the story suggested. It's not like finding a historical artifact. It's more like finding proof that magic was real, that the world used to be fundamentally different, that giants or dragons or monsters actually walk the earth. And the thing is, you'd be right, the world was fundamentally different. Giants did walk the earth, if you count mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths the size of elephants. Dragons did exist, if you count dinosaurs and giant crocodilians and 20-foot-long monitor lizards. The stories were right about the broad strokes. They just got the details wrong because they didn't have the conceptual tools to get them right. This is what separates ancient peoples from modern people. Not intelligence, but context. They were working with the same quality of reasoning we use today. the same pattern recognition, the same drive to explain the world. They just didn't have plate tectonics or evolutionary theory or radiometric dating or any of the other frameworks we use to understand deep time. So they did what any rational person would do. They fit the evidence into the explanatory framework their culture provided. And that framework said giants, heroes, monsters, the mythological past made manifest in stone. The fascinating thing is that this interpretation worked. It explained the evidence. It made predictions that turned out to be right. If the story said giants lived in a particular region, and you went there and dug around, you'd find giant bones. The mythology was functionally accurate, even though it was literally wrong. It was a pre-scientific but still systematic way of organizing information about the world. And in some ways, it's not that different from what we do today. We find evidence and fit it into the theoretical frameworks our culture provides. The difference is that our frameworks are more accurate, more predictive, better at explaining the full range of evidence. But we're still doing the same basic thing, trying to make sense of a world that's much stranger and older and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. The ancient Greeks who displayed those cyclops skulls in their temples were doing science, just not modern science. They were collecting evidence, forming hypotheses, creating explanatory frameworks. They were wrong about what the bones were, but they were absolutely right that the bones meant something important, that the past was stranger than anyone imagined, that the world had once been home to creatures that no longer existed. They just called those creatures titans instead of Pleistocene megafauna. Different words, same wonder, same very human drive to understand where we came from and what came before us. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4. 11 lines of text that have generated thousands of years of speculation, debate, and absolute fascination. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. 11 lines, that's all we get. No detailed descriptions, no origin story, no explanation of what happened to them. Just this cryptic reference to beings who are apparently important enough to mention, but not important enough to explain. The ancient scribes who compiled these texts assumed everyone knew what they were talking about. They assumed the Nephilim were common knowledge, part of the shared cultural memory of the ancient Near East. But that knowledge didn't survive intact. What we're left with is fragments, hints, shadows of a story that once made perfect sense to its original audience. The word Nephilim itself is mysterious. Hebrew scholars have debated its etymology for centuries. Some derive it from the root nephal, meaning to fall. This gave rise to that single translation choice shaped how Western civilization would understand these beings for the next 2,000 years. But here's what's interesting. The original Hebrew doesn't necessarily emphasize physical size. It emphasizes power, might, reputation. The Nephilim were Gibborim, mighty ones. They were men of the name, people whose reputations preceded them. In ancient Near Eastern culture, that could mean a lot of things. Famous warriors, legendary kings, warlords whose military prowess made them seem more than human, not necessarily individuals who stood 12 feet tall. The sons of God phrase creates another puzzle. In the ancient Near Eastern context, this phrase had multiple possible meanings. Some early Jewish and Christian interpreters took it literally. Divine beings, angels, something from the celestial realm mating with human women and producing superhuman offspring. This interpretation shows up in early Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, which elaborates the Genesis account into an entire mythology of angelic rebellion and forbidden knowledge. But other scholars point to alternative readings. In ancient Hebrew culture, sons of God could simply mean sons of the gods, powerful men, rulers, individuals from the elite class. The narrative might be describing intermarriage between noble lineages and common people, or between different ethnic groups, or even between the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain, if you follow the genealogical reading. The vagueness isn't accidental. The text seems designed to be read on multiple levels, offering different meanings to different audiences. What matters for our purposes is this. By the time other biblical texts reference giants, the writers assume these beings are real, physical, and dangerous. Numbers chapter 13 gives us the next major giant reference. The Israelite spies have returned from scouting Canaan. They report, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This is where things get historically interesting. Unlike the Genesis reference, which is set in mythical pre-flood times, the Numbers account is placed in a specific historical and geographical context. The land of Canaan, roughly corresponding to modern Israel and Palestine, during what would have been the Late Bronze Age. And the Anakim aren't just mythological constructs, they're described as an actual people group, living in actual cities. Hebron, Gaza, Gath. These are real places, places we can excavate, places with archaeological records. So did the Anakim actually exist? Almost certainly yes. But were they giants in the physical sense? That's where it gets complicated. The key phrase is, "we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." This isn't necessarily objective measurement, it's psychological. The spies were terrified, they felt small, they felt overwhelmed, and in ancient Near Eastern warfare, perception mattered as much as reality. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age Canaan shows us what the Israelite spies would have encountered. Fortified cities with massive walls, professional armies equipped with bronze weapons and chariots, urban populations that had been living in cities for thousands of years, while the Israelites were recent nomads. From the perspective of desert wanderers facing militarily superior urban civilizations, these people would have seemed like giants, not because they were literally 8 feet tall, but because they represented an overwhelming tactical and technological advantage. Some scholars suggest the Anakim might have been a warrior class or military caste within Canaanite society, elite soldiers, specially trained and equipped, possibly selected for physical size and strength. Ancient armies did this. The Greeks had their Spartans, the Persians had their immortals, warrior elites who cultivated reputations for being larger than life. Add a few generations of legends, some natural storytelling exaggeration, and you get giants. But the biblical text preserves hints that something more complex was happening. The Anakim are associated with specific cities, particularly Gath. And Gath brings us to the most famous biblical giant of all, Goliath, 1 Samuel 17. The Philistine champion emerges from the ranks. The text gives us specific measurements, 6 cubits and a span. Using the standard ancient Israelite cubit of about 18 inches, that gives us roughly 9 feet 9 inches, a genuine giant by any measure. Except there's a problem. The oldest manuscripts we have don't agree on Goliath's height. The Hebrew Masoretic text, which most modern Bibles follow, gives us the 6 cubits and a span figure. But the ancient Greek Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that preserve this story give us a different number, 4 cubits and a span. That's about 6 feet, 9 inches. Still notably tall, especially for the ancient world where average male height was probably around 5'4". But not superhuman, not impossible, just a very large man. So which number is correct? Scholars debate this, but many lean toward the 4-cubit reading being original. Here's why. Scribes copying text had a tendency to make stories more dramatic, not less. If you're copying an ancient manuscript and you see Goliath described as 6'9", you might be tempted to make him even more impressive. 9'9" certainly does that. But the reverse is unlikely. No scribe would take a 9-foot giant and make him smaller. That diminishes the story. This suggests that the original account might have described a very tall but not impossible human warrior. Over centuries of transmission, his height grew in the retelling until it reached superhuman proportions. This is exactly what we'd expect from oral tradition before texts became standardized. Details get embellished. Heroes become more heroic. Villains become more terrifying. But whether Goliath was 7 feet or 10 feet, he served a specific literary and cultural function. In ancient Near Eastern mythology, giants represented chaos, the untamed forces that stood against civilization and divine order. The Mesopotamian creation epic Enuma Elish describes the god Marduk defeating the giant chaos monster Tiamat. Egyptian mythology featured the god Seth, often depicted as abnormally large, representing disorder and violence. Giants were narrative shorthand for existential threats, enemies so dangerous they required divine intervention to defeat. The biblical giant narratives fit this pattern perfectly. The Nephilim appeared just before the flood, the great divine reset of creation. The Anakim and other giant peoples occupy the Promised Land, blocking Israel's divinely ordained destiny. Goliath defies the armies of the living God and blasphemes the divine name. In each case, giants represent obstacles that can't be overcome through normal human means. They require faith, divine assistance, or miraculous intervention. This is why David defeats Goliath with a sling stone rather than conventional weapons. The narrative isn't primarily about military tactics, it's about divine power overcoming human impossibility. The giant must be giant for the theological point to work. Some biblical texts preserve what might be historical memories of actual tall peoples in the region. Deuteronomy 2 mentions the Rephaim, described as a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. It places them in specific territories: Bashan, Moab, Ammon. Some scholars have attempted to connect these biblical references with archaeological evidence. The region of Bashan, northeast of the Sea of Galilee, contains numerous megalithic structures, dolmens made of massive stone slabs. Could these have been built by the Rephaim? Probably not. The dolmens date to various periods, and there's no evidence of an unusually tall population in the region. But the dolmens might have inspired the legends. Ancient peoples encountering these mysterious stone structures, having no idea who built them or why, might have concluded they were the work of giants. We've seen this pattern everywhere. Mysterious ancient constructions plus cultural amnesia equals giant legends. The Bible preserves one more tantalizing detail. Deuteronomy 3 describes the bed of Og, king of Bashan, described as made of iron. The text gives measurements: 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide. That's about 13 feet by 6 feet. The narrative treats this bed as a tourist attraction, something people could go and see. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? Was this an actual oversized bed that ancient visitors could inspect? Or was it a sarcophagus, a dolmen, some other large stone structure that later traditions associated with the giant king? We don't know. The site hasn't been definitively identified. But the detail suggests that real physical objects, probably megalithic structures, were being interpreted through the lens of giant legends. What's clear is that by the time these texts were being written and compiled, roughly between 900 and 400 BCE, giant narratives served multiple functions. They explained mysterious ancient ruins. They dramatized conflicts with militarily superior neighbors. They provided theological frameworks for understanding divine intervention in human history. And they connected Israelite identity to an ancient cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The giants weren't just enemies. They were the enemies, the ultimate others, beings whose very existence represented everything that stood against the divine plan. Defeating them, or in most cases surviving their defeat by divine power, became central to how ancient Israel understood its own history and purpose. But these stories didn't develop in isolation. They emerged from and contributed to a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition of giant legends. Similar beings appear in Mesopotamian, Hittite and Ugaritic texts. The biblical versions are part of a shared cultural vocabulary, variations on themes that resonated across the ancient world. Understanding this doesn't diminish the texts. It contextualizes them, shows how ancient peoples used narrative and symbol to make sense of their world. Whether the Nephilim were fallen angels or legendary warriors, whether Goliath stood 7 feet or 10 feet, the stories served their purpose. They captured something real about human experience, the feeling of facing overwhelming opposition, the terror of enemies who seem invincible, the hope that somehow, against all odds, the weak might triumph over the strong, and that hope, more than any literal interpretation of ancient measurements, is what kept these stories alive for 3,000 years. Now we need to talk about something that changes the entire conversation, because while ancient peoples were finding mammoth bones and creating legends, while scribes were recording stories of the Nephilim and Anakim, there were actual humans walking among them who would have seemed like giants. Not metaphorical giants, not legendary figures from the distant past. Real people whose bodies had grown far beyond normal human proportions. These weren't mutations or different species. They were ordinary humans with extraordinary medical conditions, and understanding them might explain more about giant legends than any fossilized mammoth femur ever could. Let's start with the science. Deep in the center of your brain, about as far from the outside world as you can get, sits a small gland called the pituitary. It's roughly the size of a pea, weighs about 0.5 gram, and it controls almost everything about how your body grows. Throughout childhood and adolescence, this tiny organ releases growth hormone in carefully regulated pulses. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to guide your bones and tissues through their developmental program until you reach your genetically programmed adult height. Then, usually around age 18 to 25, special plates in your long bones fuse closed. Growth stops. The program completes. You're done growing taller. But sometimes the pituitary gland doesn't get the message, or more precisely, a tumor develops in the gland, a usually benign growth that starts pumping out growth hormone without regulation, without the normal feedback systems that tell this to stop. If this happens before those bone plates fuse, before growth is supposed to stop, you get a condition called pituitary gigantism. The affected individual just keeps growing and growing. 6 feet becomes 7, 7 becomes 8. The skeleton stretches beyond anything human genetics ever intended. Bones lengthen past the point where muscles and connective tissues can properly support them. Organs struggle to supply blood and nutrients to a body that's become too large for its own circulatory system. If the tumor develops after the growth plates have fused, you get something different but equally dramatic. Acromegaly. The bones can't get longer anymore, but growth hormone still floods the system. So instead, bones get thicker, denser. The hands and feet enlarge. The jaw protrudes forward. The brow ridge becomes prominent. Facial features coarsen and change. Internal organs continue growing, sometimes dangerously so. The heart enlarges, struggling to pump blood through an increasingly oversized body. Both conditions are devastating. Before modern medicine, they were often fatal. The strain on the heart, the susceptibility to infections, the joint problems, the metabolic complications. Most people with untreated pituitary gigantism didn't live past 30. Many died much younger, but some survived. Some lived long enough to become legends in their own time. Robert Pershing Wadlow was born in Alton, Illinois on February 22, 1918. Normal birth weight, normal length, no indication of anything unusual, but by age 5 he was already 5 feet 4 inches tall, taller than most adult women. By age 8 he stood 6 feet. At 13 he became the tallest Boy Scout in the world at 7 feet 4 inches. His growth never stopped. When Robert Wadlow died in 1940 at age 22, he measured 8 feet 11 inches tall, the tallest reliably measured human being in recorded history. He needed leg braces to walk. His shoes were size 37, custom made, costing about $100 a pair in 1930s money. He had to duck through doorways, sleep in a specially constructed bed, sit in reinforced furniture. Every aspect of daily life required accommodation. But here's what's remarkable. Robert Wadlow wasn't treated as a freak or an outcast. He was gentle, intelligent, articulate. He studied to become a lawyer. He travelled across America as a promotional representative for a shoe company, visiting over 800 towns and appearing at countless events. Newspapers called him the gentle giant. Children loved him. Adults respected him. He was, by all accounts, a kind and patient man who handled his condition with remarkable grace, despite the constant physical pain it caused him. He died from an infected blister caused by his leg braces, a small wound that his compromised immune system couldn't fight off. Sepsis spread through his oversized body faster than 1940s medicine could treat it. He was buried in a reinforced concrete vault in Alton. His family concerned that curiosity seekers might try to steal his body for exhibition. Robert Wadlow lived in an age of photography, medical documentation, careful measurement. We know exactly how tall he was because dozens of doctors examined him. We have hundreds of photographs. We understand his condition because we can study pituitary tumours, measure growth hormone levels, track the physiological cascade that causes gigantism. But imagine if Robert Wadlow had lived 3,000 years ago, in an ancient village without medical science, without photography, without any framework to understand what was happening to him. He would have seemed supernatural, blessed by the gods or cursed by them, depending on who was interpreting. His bones, if found centuries later, would have launched 1,000 legends. The stories of his height would have grown with each retelling, 8 feet 11 inches becoming 9 feet, then 10, then 12. Within a few generations, Robert Wadlow of Alton might have become Wadlow the Titan, a giant king who ruled in ancient times, whose bones proved that gods once walked the earth. This isn't speculation. We can see exactly this pattern in historical records. Throughout history, individuals with gigantism and acromegaly appear in documentation, often surrounded by mythology and supernatural interpretation. The Romans wrote of giants in their midst. Medieval chronicles describe individuals of extraordinary stature, often as warriors or guards. Chinese records mention towering generals. Every culture has these accounts, but it's the medical details that get really interesting. Because once you know what to look for, you can sometimes diagnose ancient giants from their descriptions alone. Take Goliath, the Philistine champion from the Valley of Elah. The biblical text describes him as 6 cubits and a span, probably somewhere between 9 and 10 feet tall by ancient measurements. Impossible? Maybe. But the description includes other details that medical researchers have found fascinating. First, Goliath needed an armor-bearer to walk before him, carrying his shield. Why? A warrior that size should be perfectly capable of carrying his own equipment, unless his joints were compromised, unless the bone growth in his hands and arms made it difficult to grip weapons effectively, both common symptoms of acromegaly. Second, the text emphasizes that Goliath challenged the Israelites twice daily for 40 days, but always from a distance. He never charged, never advanced. He stood and shouted challenges. Why would a supposedly fearsome warrior stay at range, unless he couldn't see well? Pituitary tumours often compress the optic nerves. Peripheral vision goes first. People with advanced acromegaly sometimes develop tunnel vision, able to see straight ahead but blind to anything approaching from the sides. Now watch what David does. He doesn't approach head-on. He circles. He uses a sling, attacking from a distance, probably from an angle where Goliath's compromised peripheral vision couldn't track the movement. And when the stone strikes Goliath in the forehead, exactly where an enlarged brow ridge would be most prominent in someone with acromegaly, the giant falls forward, loses balance, can't recover. Exactly what you'd expect from someone whose proprioception and coordination were compromised by a pituitary tumour. This doesn't diminish the story. It makes it more human, more real. David wasn't facing a supernatural monster. He was facing a man whose body had betrayed him, whose medical condition made him simultaneously terrifying in appearance and vulnerable in combat. The courage required to face Goliath doesn't decrease because we can diagnose his condition. If anything, understanding the reality makes the account more plausible, more grounded in the actual experiences of ancient peoples. And here's where the giant legends start making perfect sense. Pituitary gigantism is rare, but it's not that rare. Modern estimates suggest it occurs in about 3 to 4 cases per million people per year. In ancient populations, before modern medicine, these individuals would have been more visible, not less. They couldn't be tucked away in hospitals. They lived in their communities if they survived, and when they died, their bones remained. Massive skeletons buried in ordinary graves, discovered decades or centuries later by people who had no framework to understand what they were seeing. A single individual with gigantism in a small ancient community would become the stuff of immediate legend. Stories would spread. Other villages would hear about the giant who lived in the mountains, or the enormous warrior who defended the valley. These stories would merge with other giant stories from other regions, each one based on a real person with a real medical condition. Layer in the occasional mammoth bone discovery, mix in religious texts about the Nephilim and Anakim, and suddenly you have a complete mythology. Giants walked the earth in ancient days. Their bones prove it. The stories prove it. The sacred texts prove it. Except what you really have is human biology operating at its extremes. Rare genetic conditions creating extraordinary individuals who lived brief, difficult lives but left lasting impressions on their communities. The giants were real. They just weren't supernatural. They were human, painfully, tragically human, living in bodies that grew beyond what human physiology can properly support, dying young from complications we now understand and can sometimes treat. We remember them as monsters or demigods. We should remember them as people, as Robert Wadlow, gentle and patient despite constant pain. As whatever Goliath's real name was, a man whose body failed him at the worst possible moment. As thousands of unnamed individuals throughout history, whose unusual height made them objects of wonder, fear, worship, or persecution. Their stories became the foundation of our giant myths, but their reality was far more interesting than any legend. Because the truth is this: the human body is capable of extraordinary variations, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, always remarkable. And when those variations appeared in ages before medical science could explain them, people did what people have always done. They created stories. Stories big enough to match what they were seeing. Stories that would outlive the individuals by thousands of years. Stories that would eventually become the giant legends we're still trying to understand today. But bones and medical conditions can only explain so much. Because not all giant stories came from real people or real fossils. Some were deliberate fabrications, hoaxes designed to deceive, and those stories somehow became just as powerful as the real ones. October 16th, 1869, a farm in Cardiff, New York. Two workers are digging a well behind a barn. The soil is typical upstate New York ground, rocky, stubborn, the kind that makes you earn every foot. They're about 3 feet down when their shovels hit something solid. Not rock exactly, something different. They keep digging, clearing away dirt, and then one of them stops, steps back, calls for the other to look. There's a foot, a human foot, but it's massive, 3 feet across, and it's made of stone. Within hours the farmyard is crowded. Neighbours arrive first, then people from town. Word spreads fast in 1869, faster than you'd think. By evening there are hundreds of people standing around the pit, staring down at what's emerging from the soil. A giant, a perfect petrified giant over 10 feet tall, lying on its side with one hand on its stomach. The detail is incredible. You can see fingernails, pores in the skin. The expression on its face seems peaceful, almost serene, like he'd just laid down for a rest thousands of years ago and turned to stone. The farmer who owned the land, a man named William Newell, he charged admission immediately. 50 cents to view the giant. People lined up. They came from Syracuse, from Albany, from all over New York State. Within days he raised it to $1. People still came. Crowds so large they had to set up viewing times. The newspapers went wild. Was this proof of the biblical giants? Evidence of an ancient race? A victim of Noah's flood who'd been petrified by divine judgment? Scientific opinion was divided, which only made it better for the crowds. Some declared it an authentic petrified human. Others called it a statue carved by ancient peoples. A few skeptics suggested it might be more recent, but they were drowned out by the excitement. This was exactly what people wanted to find. Physical proof that the old stories were real, that the world was stranger and more wonderful than modern science suggested, that giants had walked the earth. What nobody knew yet was that the whole thing was a con, and an elaborate one. The farmer William Newell had a cousin named George Hull. A year earlier they'd been in Iowa, and Hull had gotten into an argument with a Methodist revivalist preacher about biblical literalism. The preacher insisted that giants had existed because the Bible said so, and the Bible couldn't be wrong. Hull was an atheist and a schemer, and sitting there listening to this preacher, an idea formed. If people were this desperate to believe in biblical giants, he could give them one, and make a fortune doing it. He bought a 5-ton block of gypsum from a quarry in Iowa, told the quarry workers it was for a patriotic monument, had it shipped to Chicago where he hired a stonecutter named Edward Burghardt to carve it. The instructions were specific. Make it look like a petrified giant, 10 feet tall, anatomically correct but obviously ancient. They worked on it for months, carving, aging the surface with sulfuric acid to create weathering, pounding it with darning needles to simulate pores. When it was finished, Hull had it shipped to his cousin's farm in Cardiff. They buried it at night, let it sit for a year while the ground settled around it, then arranged for those workers to dig a well in exactly that spot. The Cardiff giant made them rich. For a while. Within weeks, a syndicate bought 3/4 ownership for $30,000, which would be over $700,000 today. They moved the giant to Syracuse, then to New York City. Thousands paid to see it. But here's where the story gets even better. P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman in American history, he wanted in. He offered to buy the giant. When the owners refused, Barnum did what Barnum did. He commissioned a replica, a fake of a fake, and he advertised his as the real Cardiff giant, claiming the one in New York was the forgery. The owners sued. The case went to court. And during the trial, the whole hoax unraveled. The stonecutter testified. Hull confessed. The judge ruled that Barnum couldn't be sued for calling his fake giant real because the original was fake too. You can't claim damages for counterfeiting a fraud. But here's the wildest part. Even after everyone knew it was a hoax, people still paid to see it. The giant still drew crowds. Because knowing it was fake didn't make it less interesting. It just changed what they were looking at. Not a petrified ancient, but proof that Americans in 1869 wanted so badly to believe in giants that someone could make a fortune giving them one. The Cardiff giant wasn't the first giant hoax. It wasn't even close. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers regularly reported discoveries of giant skeletons. 7 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet tall. Most were exaggerations of normal remains. Some were misidentified animal bones. A few were deliberate frauds. But they all shared something in common. People believed them, or wanted to. In 1877, a photographer in Colorado created a series of images showing prospectors posing with enormous petrified giant. The photos circulated widely, published in newspapers across the country. They were obvious fakes if you looked closely. The scale was wrong, the lighting inconsistent, the giant made of plaster. But people wanted to believe, so they did. Other hoaxes were more ambitious. In the 1890s, newspaper accounts described discoveries of entire giant cities in remote caves, ancient copper mines worked by people of enormous stature, mummified giants in dry caves throughout the West. Most of these stories originated with journalists who knew a sensational story sold papers. Some came from local boosters trying to attract tourists. A few came from genuine misunderstandings, people finding large animal bones and interpreting them through the lens of what they expected to find. The early 20th century brought photographic hoaxes, crude composites showing archaeologists standing next to titanic skeletons. These proliferated in the age of tabloid newspapers, then again with the internet. Each generation's technology enabled new kinds of fraud. Each generation's audience proved equally willing to believe. But why? That's the interesting question. Why were people so eager to accept these obvious frauds? It wasn't stupidity. Many of the people who believed in the Cardiff giant were educated, intelligent, normally skeptical. Something about giants short-circuited their critical thinking, made them want to believe despite the evidence. Part of it was religious. In 19th century America, biblical literalism was widespread. If the Bible mentioned giants, giants must have existed. Finding physical proof validated everything else in Scripture. It made faith tangible. You could point to a 10-foot statue and say, see, the old stories are true. Everything our grandparents told us about the ancient world is real. But it went deeper than religion. Giants represented something fundamental about how we understand the past. The ancient world seems larger than life in our imagination. Greater, more mythic. Finding physical giants confirmed that feeling. It suggested that the past really was different. That humans used to be more than we are now, stronger, bigger, closer to the divine. There's something deeply appealing about that narrative. It makes history meaningful in a way that dry facts about normal-sized ancient people never can. Giants also provided simple answers to difficult questions. How did ancient peoples build massive stone structures? Giants did it. How do we explain the enormous bones sometimes found in caves? Giants. The world is full of mysteries, and giants resolve them all at once. No need for complex theories about construction techniques or Ice Age megafauna. Just giants. Big people who could do big things. The hoaxes damaged legitimate archaeology in ways we're still dealing with. When genuine discoveries of unusually tall individuals were reported, people assumed they were frauds like Cardiff. When archaeologists tried to explain that some ancient peoples were taller on average than modern populations due to diet or genetics, they were dismissed as part of a cover-up. The frauds poisoned the well. They made it impossible to have nuanced conversations about human physical diversity in the past. They also created a template that conspiracy theorists still use. The basic structure is always the same. announce a sensational discovery, provide dubious evidence, claim mainstream scientists are suppressing the truth, point to the suppression as proof of the discovery's importance. The Cardiff giant wasn't the first time this pattern appeared, but it refined it. It showed that you could make money and gain attention by giving people what they wanted to believe, regardless of truth. And yet, there's something understandably human about all of it. We want the world to be full of wonders. We want the past to be dramatic and strange. We want there to be mysteries still unsolved, secrets still hidden. Giants satisfy all these desires at once. They're big enough to see, concrete enough to believe in, but rare enough to remain magical. When someone announces they've found a giant, what they're really saying is that the world is more interesting than you thought. That beneath the ordinary surface of farms and caves and archaeological sites, there are extraordinary things waiting to be discovered. That magic hasn't entirely left the world. For people living in an age of increasing scientific rationality, where every mystery seems to have a mundane explanation, giants promised something more. They promised wonder. The desire for wonder sometimes overrides critical thinking, not because people are foolish, but because wonder feels necessary. A world without mysteries is a world diminished. A past populated entirely by normal-sized people doing explicable things with understandable tools feels less meaningful than a past where giants walked and the impossible was commonplace. So we made giants. When we couldn't find them, we carved them. When we carved them and got caught, we carved them again. And even when everyone admitted they were fake, we paid to see them anyway. Because what we were really looking at wasn't gypsum carved to look like a petrified giant. It was our own longing, our own hunger for a world larger and stranger than the one we inhabit. The Cardiff giant wasn't a hoax because someone made a fake giant. It was a hoax because we made ourselves believe it. And in a way, that tells us more about who we are than any real giant ever could. Picture this. A dusty attic deep beneath the Smithsonian. Wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. Faded shipping labels from forgotten expeditions. A single bare light bulb swinging slowly. And inside those crates, skulls with double rows of teeth. Leg bones longer than a man is tall. The remains, we're told, of a race of giants that walked North America before history began. Hidden, suppressed. Erased from the record so the official story of human evolution could remain neat and manageable. It's a powerful image. It feels like the opening shot of a movie you'd absolutely keep watching. And for a lot of people, this isn't just a movie scene. It's a belief, a conviction that the Smithsonian Institution, the symbol of American science and museums, once collected giant skeletons by the wagon load, and then quietly made them disappear. In this chapter, we're going to walk slowly into that attic. Not the imaginary one in the conspiracy stories, but the real historical attic. 19th century newspapers, early excavation practices, institutional politics, and the very human tendency to mistrust big, powerful organizations. We're not here to mock. We're not here to sneer at people who ask questions. We're here to separate the bones of fact from the cartilage of rumor, to see what's actually buried under all those dramatic headlines. Let's start at the supposed beginning. If you search for Smithsonian giant skeletons, you'll find the same pattern repeated over and over. Screenshots of old newspaper clippings, paragraphs with breathless language, giant skeleton unearthed, bones measuring 10, even 12 feet tall, turned over to the Smithsonian for further study, then the punchline, and after that, nothing. No museum display, no published report, just silence. Convenient silence, the conspiracy theory says. But where did these headlines come from? To answer that, we have to step back into the 1800s, the age of telegraphs and typesetting, the age when newspapers were trying to do, in ink and paper, what clickbait headlines do on your phone today. Grab your attention before you turn the page, or buy a different paper. In the late 19th century, American journalism had a very specific flavour. Historians call one strain of it yellow journalism. Highly competitive city newspapers would run sensational stories with minimal fact-checking, because being first mattered more than being right. Reports would bounce from one paper to another through wire services, changing a little with each retelling. A local farmer finds some big bones in a mound. The first article might say, "unusually large skeleton." The next in a neighbouring city might upgrade that to "giant skeleton." By the time the story reached a major metropolitan paper, the skeleton is 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more, because more sells better than about average, maybe a bit tall. Measurements were often reported without context or precision. A femur 2 feet long might have been measured quickly with a stick or guessed by eye. A skeleton said to be 9 feet might have been an estimate over the curve of the grave, not an actual bone-by-bone reconstruction. And sometimes, frankly, numbers were just inflated because no one in the printing office had ever seen an actual detailed osteology report. Now add something else. The 1800s were also the heyday of what we might call mound fever in North America. Thousands of earthen mounds built by indigenous cultures were being dug into by farmers, amateurs, treasure hunters, and eventually professional archaeologists. Finds were real, artifacts were real, human remains were real. But the people doing the digging were not always very careful, and the people doing the writing were rarely experts. This is where the Smithsonian enters the story. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology and related programs did in fact send researchers into the field. They did in fact receive bones, artifacts and skeletal remains collected from mounds and burial sites. Their annual reports, many of which are now freely available online, describe hundreds, even thousands, of skeletons studied in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These skeletons are not imaginary. They're not part of a cover-up. They're part of the documented history of North American archaeology. But here's the important part. When you read those reports carefully, you don't find 10-foot giants. You find normal ranges of human height, with a few individuals who are tall for their time, maybe 6 feet, maybe a bit more, standing out in populations where the average was closer to 5'6" or less. So how do we get from a few tall individuals to suppressed race of giants? Through a mix of misunderstandings, exaggerations, and the natural half-life of rumour. Many 19th century newspaper stories that mention the Smithsonian never involved a Smithsonian scientist on site. A local digger might say, "We'll send these to the Smithsonian," or a journalist might assume that was the logical destination and write it as a fact. Later retellings would smooth over the uncertainty. The skeletons were turned over to the Smithsonian, whether they ever arrived or not. In other cases, boxes of bones did arrive, and then disappeared in a different, much more mundane way. Not into a secret vault of forbidden knowledge, but into the chaos of early collections management. Museums in the 1800s and early 1900s were not the carefully controlled, climate-regulated institutions we imagine today. Catalogue systems were basic. Specimens were often poorly labelled, sometimes not labelled at all. Remains from multiple sites might be jumbled together. Over time, boxes could be misplaced, misfiled, reclassified, or quietly discarded if they were damaged or considered redundant. This isn't a uniquely Smithsonian problem. It's a problem of early science in general. The same was true in European museums, in university collections, in local historical societies. The idea of long-term, meticulously trackable curation was still evolving. So when someone goes looking, in the 21st century, for a specific skeleton mentioned in an 1870 newspaper clip, they often can't find it. The paperwork never existed, or was never complete. The bones were catalogued in a vague way or lumped in with a general lot of remains from Ohio mounds or Tennessee burials. or they were reburied or repatriated or lost in a building move. To a conspiracy-minded thinker, that absence looks suspicious. To a historian of science, it looks depressingly normal. But if it's so normal, why does the idea of a deliberate cover-up have such staying power? Part of the answer has nothing to do with bones at all, and everything to do with trust. Large institutions, governments, churches, universities, museums, have made real mistakes. They've misinterpreted data. They've enforced harmful narratives. They've ignored indigenous voices. They've sometimes been slow to correct themselves, or resistant to evidence that challenged their frameworks. In North America, early archaeology often treated Native American remains as objects, not ancestors. Skeletons were taken without consent, displayed without respect, and studied through lenses that downplayed the complexity and antiquity of indigenous cultures. The mound builder myth itself, the idea that some vanished non-native race built the earthworks, was used to deny native peoples their own history. That's not conspiracy theory. That's documented reality. So when people today hear that thousands of skeletons were dug up, carted off, and then disappeared into museum basements, it's not unreasonable for them to be skeptical, especially when those same institutions were, for generations, slow to acknowledge the full humanity and sophisticated achievements of indigenous societies. Institutional distrust doesn't grow in a vacuum, it grows in the soil of real grievance. And yet, acknowledging those wrongs does not require us to accept every story that grows out of that distrust. We can say, very clearly, early archaeology did harmful things. It mishandled remains. It misinterpreted data. It sometimes erased indigenous voices. All of that is true. We can also say there's no solid evidence that the Smithsonian or any other major institution systematically hunted down and destroyed 10-foot-tall giant skeletons to protect a fragile scientific theory. When you look closely at the origin points of specific giant stories, a pattern emerges. A reporter hears an excavation found large bones. The story runs with embellished details. Another paper copies it with even more flair. The original bones are never measured properly, never photographed with scale, never described in a peer-reviewed report. Decades later, all that survives is the clipping. Conspiracy websites collect hundreds of such clippings and lay them out like tiles in a mosaic, pointing to the pattern. But a pattern of noisy, low-quality data is not the same as a pattern of suppressed truth. It's often just a pattern of how news travelled before fact-checking and standardised reporting. Then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Internet did what the telegraph did a century earlier, but faster. Old newspaper archives were digitised. Headlines about giant skeletons were suddenly searchable. Forums and videos and blogs began to stitch them together, add ominous music, and ask why the Smithsonian was so quiet. The answer is slightly less cinematic, because most of those stories never involved real giants in the first place. Many involved normal humans, described with loose language. Some involved animal bones misidentified by amateurs. Some involved hearsay that never even reached a scientist. Every now and then, someone will point to an old photograph, grainy black and white, showing enormous bones arranged like dinosaur displays, towering over tiny workers in hats. These images often turn out to be modern hoaxes created with Photoshop or optical illusions from forced perspective. In some cases, they're actual archaeological photos that have been rescaled or miscaptioned. None of this means we should stop asking questions about how history is recorded. It doesn't mean we have to abandon the sense of wonder that makes us lean forward when we hear the word giant. It just means that, as with the bottlenecks and lost human species we talked about earlier, reality is often both stranger and subtler than the simplest story. Instead of a neat narrative of giants existed, Smithsonian destroyed them, we find a messier picture. Real tall individuals standing out in shorter populations. Real mounds, built by real cultures whose descendants are still here. Real bones, often handled clumsily, sometimes lost, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes finally returned to their communities under modern repatriation laws. We also find a deep, ongoing conversation about who gets to tell the story of the past. Museum curators, indigenous elders, geneticists, local historians, amateur researchers, skeptical bloggers, giant enthusiasts. Everyone is, in one way or another, trying to claim a piece of the narrative. In that sense, the Smithsonian conspiracy is less about boxes of bones in a hidden basement, and more about a public negotiation over authority. When people say they're hiding the giants, they are perhaps also saying, we don't entirely trust the people who tell us what is and isn't possible. And that feeling is worth listening to, even if the specific claim about 12-foot skeletons doesn't hold up. So, as you lie there, drifting, imagine a different kind of attic in the Smithsonian. Not one filled with gigantic skulls, but one filled with paper, handwritten field notes from 1887, fading catalogues, letters from local collectors, newspaper clippings glued into scrapbooks, the fossil record of how stories themselves evolve. In those pages you can see the transformation. A tall skeleton becomes a giant. A large femur becomes evidence of a lost race. An institution that actually did gather enormous amounts of data on indigenous cultures becomes, in the popular imagination, the villain of a grand cover-up. But you can also see something else. The same curiosity that drives people to search for giants is the curiosity that drove early archaeologists into the mounds, that drives modern scientists to sequence ancient DNA, that drives storytellers to sit up late, wondering what came before us. Instead of dismissing that curiosity, we can redirect it. If there are no 10-foot-tall skeletons hidden away, what else might be hiding in plain sight? Unknown lineages glimpsed in our genomes, lost cities slowly emerging from under forest canopies, misinterpreted artifacts that, when revisited, tell a very different story about who built what and when. The real conspiracy, if there is one, is quieter and more profound. The universe seems to insist on being more complex than our favourite legends. The past refuses to stay simple. Every answer births new questions, and the giants, whether they lived only in myths or as unusually tall individuals misunderstood by their neighbours, still loom over our imagination. In the next chapter, we'll leave the basements and archives behind and step out into the open air to meet the real giants of recorded history, the people whose heights were measured, whose clothes still exist, whose footsteps we can almost follow. Not hidden, not suppressed, just waiting to be seen for what they truly were. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you've just stepped out of a thatched hall in the Bronze Age. You're an ordinary person for your time, maybe 5'4", 5'5" if you're lucky. The world around you is built to that scale. Doorways, beds, tools, all shaped for bodies roughly your size. Now picture a stranger walking into your village. He has to duck through the doorway. His shoulders barely clear the lintel. When he stands up straight, he's not just taller than everyone else. He's a head, a neck, and part of a chest above your tallest warrior. 6'6", maybe 6'8". In a crowd of people a full foot shorter, he doesn't just look tall, he looks impossible. That feeling of seeing a body that doesn't fit your expectations of what a human can be is at the heart of our stories about giants. And it turns out history is full of people who would have seemed just as unbelievable in their own time as any fairy tale titan. Let's meet a few of them. Angus MacAskill was born in 1825 on the Isle of Berneray in the Outer Hebrides, off the coast of Scotland, and grew up in Nova Scotia. He wasn't a sickly child warped by disease. By all accounts, he was proportionate, strong and healthy. But he didn't stop growing when everyone else did. Angus is often cited as the tallest, non-pathological giant in recorded history, meaning he probably didn't have a tumour or classic gigantism. Contemporary measurements and multiple witnesses put him around 7'9". His hands could reportedly span over a foot. His shoes were more like small boats. He wasn't just tall, he was powerful. Stories describe him lifting a 300-pound barrel to a ship's deck, effortlessly straightening iron bars that others couldn't bend, carrying full-grown men under each arm. Some of that is undoubtedly myth-making. But enough reports agree that we can be fairly confident he was far beyond normal human strength. In a modern city, Angus would stand out. In the mid-19th century, when average male height in many regions was closer to 5'6", he might as well have been another species. People flocked to see him. He toured with circuses. Queens and kings invited him to court. To them, he wasn't just unusually tall, he was a living giant. A few decades later, in the American South, another extraordinary figure grew up in a completely different world. John William Rogan was born in Tennessee in 1868, the son of formerly enslaved parents. His childhood was ordinary until around age 13, when his body began an explosive growth spurt. Unlike Angus, John probably suffered from a severe form of gigantism or related endocrine disorder. His bones grew faster than his joints could handle. Walking became painful, then impossible. But he never stopped growing upward. By the time he reached adulthood, John Rogan is believed to have stood around 8'9". Even allowing for some exaggeration, his height is well documented by photographs, medical examinations, and a life mask. He remains one of the tallest individuals reliably measured in history. Yet his life was not a fairy tale. He moved about in a custom wheelchair. He made a living selling postcards with his image. In an era of segregation and racial violence, a man with black ancestry and a body that drew constant attention lived at the intersection of prejudice and fascination. People who visited him didn't just see an unusually tall person. They saw a frame that pushed the limits of what human bones can support. Then there's Väinö Millirin, born in Finland in 1909. If Angus MacAskill was the strong man of the 19th century and John Rogan the tragic colossus, Väinö was something in between. A modern giant we can see in clear photographs, standing next to ordinary people and dwarfing them. Väinö reached about 7'3" in his teens, stopped growing for a while, then experienced a second growth spurt in his 20s, a sign of acromegaly, a related endocrine condition. He plateaued around 8'3". Unlike John Rogan, he was mobile enough to serve in the Finnish army, later becoming a professional wrestler and showman. In pictures, he towers over cars, soldiers, and city streets built to normal human proportions. He doesn't look like a cartoon caricature. He looks like a man sized up by 20 or 30%, just enough to make everything else in the scene look like it has shrunk. Taken together, these three lives show something important. You don't need mythical bloodlines or lost races to get a giant in the human sense. You just need a rare combination of genetic variation, hormonal quirks, and timing. But there's another side to the story of height. Not individual outliers, but entire populations that lean toward tall. Travel now, in your mind, to the flooded plains of the Nile's upper reaches, to what is now South Sudan. For generations, anthropologists have noted that some Nilotic groups, including the Dinka, are remarkably tall. Historical averages measured in some communities have hovered around 6 foot or more for men, with many individuals considerably taller. Photographs from the mid-20th century show Dinka herders standing head and shoulders above European visitors. This isn't magic, it's biology. The Dinka and related groups appear to carry genetic variants that favour long limbs and lean builds, a classic adaptation to hot climates, helping radiate heat. Combine that with traditional diets rich in milk, blood and cattle products, plus, in some periods, relatively low childhood disease compared to crowded cities, and you get bodies that grow long. Shift now to an entirely different landscape. Damp, flat, crisscrossed by canals, the Netherlands. If you looked at average male heights in Europe in the 1850s, the Dutch were unremarkable, sometimes even on the shorter side. But in the 20th century, something changed. By the early 2000s, Dutch men were averaging around 6 foot, making them some of the tallest populations in the world. What happened? Not a sudden invasion of giants, but a slow revolution in nutrition, healthcare, and social conditions. More protein, better distribution of food, fewer childhood infections, cleaner water, improved prenatal care. All of these let the genetic potential for height express itself more fully. There's also evidence that in the Netherlands, taller men have had slightly more children over recent generations, nudging the average upward through natural selection. From Dinka cattle camps to Dutch bicycles, you see the same pattern. Height isn't fixed. It's the product of genes, diet, disease load and environment all pulling in different directions. When conditions line up, whole populations can drift upward on the measuring stick. Now imagine encountering one of these tall populations when your own group is underfed, disease-ridden, and averages 5'3". This is what happened, over and over, when European explorers began roaming the world and writing about the giants they met. Sail down the South American coast with Ferdinand Magellan's expedition in the 1520s. In the cold winds of what is now Patagonia, Europeans encountered the Tehuelche and other indigenous peoples. Many of these groups were taller than the Spanish and Portuguese sailors, some individuals standing around 6 foot or more. In an era when a 5'7" man could be considered sturdy, a well-fed, broad-shouldered hunter approaching 6 foot would seem enormous. Reports filtered back to Europe of Patagonian giants, people twice the height of a man striding across the plains. Maps adorned with sketches of hulking figures helped sell stories and books. Reality was more mundane and more interesting. Archaeological evidence and later measurements suggest a robust, relatively tall population, not a race of Goliaths. But to sailors half-starved from months at sea, shivering in alien winds, those tall strangers were close enough to giants to stick in cultural memory. The same pattern shows up in reports of the Watusi, a colonial-era term Europeans used for the Tutsi of East Africa. The Tutsi are, on average, taller than many neighbouring groups, with long limbs and narrow builds shaped by genetics and environment. When European officers and missionaries met Tutsi courts in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they wrote breathless accounts of towering warriors and giant bodyguards. Were some individuals genuinely very tall? Almost certainly. But were they 12-foot titans? No. Exaggeration crept in through surprise, cultural bias, and the human love of a good story. Everywhere explorers went, whenever they met a group even a few inches taller on average, the word giant appeared in journals and letters. It became a reflex, a shorthand for "they looked big to me," and this takes us back to that Bronze Age warrior, ducking through the hall entrance. In many ancient societies, average male height hovered somewhere between 5'3" and 5'7", depending on region, diet, and disease. Periods of famine, heavy labour, and early infections could stunt growth dramatically. In skeletal remains from some medieval European populations, a man just under 5'6" could be near the upper end. Drop a single 6'6" individual into that world and you don't just get a tall person, you get a legend. A young boy sees him once and stiff-collared officers into writing about giant tribes. Giant, it turns out, is not a fixed category. It's a feeling. It's the shiver that runs through you when someone steps into the room and your brain has to resize its idea of what a human can be. In the Bronze Age, that threshold might have been 6 foot. In the 19th century, 7.5. Today, in a world where basketball players brush 7 feet, it takes even more to trigger that sense of unreality. But the psychology's the same. Our ancestors didn't invent giants out of nothing. They started with real bodies, tall individuals, tall families, tall peoples, and then stretched them across generations of storytelling. They smoothed away illness and suffering, added strength and menace or kindness and wisdom, until those tall humans became something else in the collective imagination. In the quiet as you drift towards sleep, you can hold both truths at once. On one level, there have been no 12-foot races marching across our historical record, no secret nations of titans hiding in caves. On another level, we have always lived beside people who were, in their own time and place, giants. And the word giant itself is a mirror, reflecting not just how tall someone stands, but how small or hungry or awed the watcher feels. In the next chapter, we'll leave these flesh and blood tall people behind and turn to stone, to the megaliths, monuments, and vast blocks that so often get tied to giants. If no lost race of titans built them, who did? And what does it actually take for ordinary humans to move stones the size of houses? Picture yourself walking at dawn through a field that looks like any other. Wet grass, low mist, a few scattered birds starting their day, and then, out of the haze, shapes start to appear. Not trees, not hills, stones, immense stones, taller than houses, arranged in circles and horseshoes, standing there as if some invisible hand had placed them one by one. You've just walked into Stonehenge. For thousands of years, people have looked at places like this and had the same first reaction. There's no way ordinary humans did this. From England's lonely Salisbury Plain to the terraced heights above Cusco, from the cliffs of Lebanon to a wind-battered island in the middle of the Pacific, the planet is strewn with stone puzzles, huge blocks, impossible angles, weights that seem to laugh at gravity. And in story after story, the answer that generations gave themselves was simple: giants did it. Let's walk slowly among a few of the most famous of these places and see what we really know about who built them and how. Start again at Stonehenge. Some of the stones here, the so-called sarsens, weigh up to 25 tons each. The tallest is more than 4 meters high. Others, the bluestones, came from quarries in the Prehistoric hills of Wales, about 140 miles away. In the age before steel, before wheels with ball bearings, before cranes, someone quarried them, shaped them, moved them across rivers and hills and set them upright, some crowned with horizontal lintels, jointed like giant stone carpentry. Medieval writers said Merlin the wizard flew them from Ireland. Folklore said giants had carried them across the sea. Even in the 1800s, serious scholars suggested some sort of vanished superior race might be responsible. Today, archaeologists have a different picture, not a simple one, but a human one. Experimental archaeology groups have tried to move replica stones using only materials that would have been available to Neolithic builders. Logs as rollers, sledges made of wood, ropes woven from plant fibres. The results are surprising if you've spent your life thinking only machines can handle heavy lifting. With a few dozen people, a 20-ton stone can be inched forward, centimetre by centimetre, by levering and rolling. With a prepared path, it can be dragged on grease sleds over damp ground, or floated on rafts along waterways. Raising a stone is basically a slow-motion seesaw. You dig a pit, tip the stone in partly, haul on ropes while you pack the base with rubble and earth, then lever and fill until the giant stands upright. No giant footsteps, just hundreds of quietly calloused human hands. Now shift your attention 3,000 miles away, to Lebanon, to a place called Baalbek. Here, the imagination really starts to strain. At the Temple of Jupiter, the foundation platform includes 3 stones known as the trilithon. Each one is around 800 tons. Nearby in the quarry lies an even larger block over 1,000 tons, still partly attached to the bedrock. The Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a name that hints at the idea of something not yet born, a project abandoned mid-creation. Roman engineers did build here, that much is clear. They loved ambitious stonework, but stories long predate the Romans. Local legends said that before the flood, a race of giants lived in this region and raised these stones as part of a vast complex. Medieval accounts claim Nimrod's men, or Solomon's demons, had moved them. Some modern fringe theories still talk about advanced lost civilizations, or even extraterrestrials aligning monoliths with mysterious energies. But when engineers look at Baalbek, they don't see magic. They see geometry, leverage, and a lot of labour. You don't necessarily have to move an 800-ton stone all at once. You can carve it in situ, using ramps and earth embankments so the block never dangles free in open air. You raise the ground to meet the stone, then remove the earth once everything is in place. You use teams of oxen and hundreds of people pulling ropes, while others pack stones and earth under the moving block to prevent catastrophic tipping. Experimental projects with much smaller stones show the same principle. The key is not impossible strength in one pair of hands, it's coordination, timing, knowledge passed down over generations. This slope is too steep. That angle will crack the stone. This kind of wood is less likely to snap under tension. Now sail across the world again, to one of the loneliest inhabited places on Earth, Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. You stand on the coast, waves breaking hard against black volcanic rock. Above you, 30-foot figures stare inland with impassive eyes. The Moai, some weigh over 70 tons. Many were carved at a central quarry, then moved miles across rough island terrain, and finally raised onto stone platforms called Ahu. When the first Europeans arrived, some islanders told them the statues had walked into place. European ears heard this and imagined sorcery, or dismissed it as fantasy. Later writers took that walking literally, giants, demigods, or even levitation. Anthropologists asked a different question. What could walk mean in engineering terms? In 2012, an experimental team built a replica Moai and tried to make it walk, using only ropes and people power. They stood groups of pullers on either side, rocked the statue forward in a controlled wobble, alternately tightening and loosening the ropes. The statue swayed, tipped, and moved, slowly, with care. But it shuffled along the ground like a refrigerator being walked across a kitchen floor. No wheels, no cranes, no giant, just rhythm, teamwork, and the patient, almost musical use of gravity. Finally, climb in your mind to 3,700 meters above sea level to the Andean city of Cusco and look up to the great zigzag walls of Sacsayhuaman. Here, blocks of andesite and limestone, some weighing over 100 tons, fit together with uncanny precision. No mortar. Just stone leaning against stone seems so tight that later, chroniclers said you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. The walls twist and turn in 3 great tiers. From above, they resemble the teeth of some enormous creature biting into the hill. When the Spanish saw this, they asked how it had been done. Some Inca and later Quechua storytellers said the stones were lightened by prayers or carried by pururaucas, warrior stones animated by the gods. Others said the work had been done by giants, or by people in some ancient time who had powers that the present generation no longer possessed. Modern archaeology describes something different. Quarry marks trace the path from the nearby rock faces down to the building site. Ramps and terraces suggest stones were dragged, slid and levered upward using earthworks that were later cut away. The astonishing fit between blocks doesn't require lasers or lost machines. It requires time. You rough fit 2 stones together, mark every point of contact with pigment, shave down the high spots, and repeat again and again until the pieces lock in place. It's not impossible strength. It's obsessive craftsmanship. So why, across continents and centuries, do humans so consistently say, giants built this, instead of, our great-grandparents were architectural geniuses? Part of it is simple awe. When you stand next to a 70-ton statue, or under a 25-ton lintel, your body knows instinctively that you could never move this thing alone. The stone dwarfs you. It shrinks your sense of what an individual can do. Giants are a natural metaphor for work on a giant scale. Part of it is the way memory works. Oral traditions can preserve amazing details for centuries, but they also compress and simplify. Think about your own family stories. The exhausting decades of effort become a single sentence. Your great-grandfather built this house. The countless hands that raise Stonehenge or Sacsayhuaman blur into the ancients and then into the giants. It's a tidy narrative shortcut. There's also something psychologically comfortable about putting overwhelming achievements just a little out of reach. If we admit that people with no electricity, no modern math, and no computers could plan astronomical alignments, model load-bearing walls, and orchestrate continent-spanning labour projects, then we have to admit something else. Our ancestors were not naive primitives fumbling in the dark. They were engineers, logisticians, experimental scientists of stone, wood, fibre, and human muscle. Sometimes it feels easier, oddly, to credit a race of giants than to accept that people very much like us, with the same sized brains and the same hands, did things we might struggle to replicate even today without heavy machinery. Experimental archaeologists keep quietly chipping away at that discomfort. A single man with simple tools has shown he can raise multi-ton blocks alone by building clever wooden frames, tipping the stones little by little and stacking shims. Community groups have dragged stones weighing several tons over long distances, given nothing more than food, shelter, and time. At every turn the pattern is the same. When we stop assuming ancient builders were helpless, their accomplishments stop looking impossible. Does that mean every question is answered? No. Some methods remain debated. Did the Rapa Nui prefer sledges or walking moai? Exactly which ramp designs did the Andean masons use? How did Neolithic Britons coordinate seasonal labour and transport? Not knowing all the details leaves room for wonder. But wonder doesn't require giants. The romance of the mystery, the feeling that there must be something more than just humans and rocks and ropes, is powerful. It's the same impulse that populates dark forests with spirits and strange lights in the sky with visitors from other worlds. Our minds look at the gap between what we know and what we see, and they reach for the most dramatic bridge possible. Yet the equally dramatic truth is this: a village that decides together to move a mountain one pebble at a time can rival any giant. Imagine the soundscape of these building projects, the rhythmic chants as teams hauled on ropes at Stonehenge, the shouted commands up the slopes of Sacsayhuaman as a block shifted into place, the laughter, frustration, and relief on Rapa Nui when a statue took its first tentative steps down a prepared path. Night fires burning near quarries, tools being sharpened, stories being told about why this temple, this circle, this wall had to exist. Those stories, over centuries, turned human workers into giants. And in a symbolic way, they weren't wrong. A coordinated community can behave like a single, larger being, one with strength and reach far beyond any individual. When you lie back and think about megaliths, about Baalbek and Stonehenge and the Moai and Sacsayhuaman, you don't have to choose between wonder and reality. You can let both sit together quietly. On one side, the old tales of giants striding across the land with boulders on their shoulders. On the other, the image of sun-browned hands gripping ropes, feet digging into earth, brains calculating angles and forces without ever writing a formula. In the end, the question who built them has an answer that is both simpler and more astonishing than many of the legends. People did. People with the same chromosomes that survived that ancient bottleneck. People whose descendants would tell stories of giants because giants was the only word big enough to hold what their ancestors had achieved. And as you drift towards sleep, you can picture them not as faceless labourers, but as real individuals, tired, determined, proud, looking up at the stone they had just raised, feeling small beside it, and yet knowing at some deep unspoken level that together they had been something larger than themselves, large enough, in time, to be remembered as giants. Picture a dark cottage, fire burning low, wind moving softly through the thatch. An elder leans in, children gather close, eyes reflecting the flames, and the story begins the way so many stories begin. Once upon a time, there was a giant. But which kind? The child-eating monster roaring fee-fee-fo-fum from the top of a beanstalk? The wise hero striding across mountains in a single step? Or the lonely, gentle creature who just wants a friend? Across human history, giants in our stories have been all of these things: man-eaters, city-crushers, mountain builders, and also babysitters, guardians, misunderstood neighbours. The figure stays the same: huge body, bigger than any real human. What changes is what that size means. Let's start with one of the most familiar. You're probably already seen the beanstalk. Jack and the beanstalk is the classic English giant story. Poor boy. Magic beans, sky-piercing vine, castle in the clouds and up there. A giant who smells human blood and wants to grind bones to make his bread. The giant lives above the human world. He hoards impossible treasures. He doesn't follow normal rules of justice or morality. He's hungry, cruel, and careless. In that story, the giant is less a character and more a force. He's greed with a body, appetite made visible. He stands in for everything that feels huge and unfair when you're powerless. Landlords, kings, famines, bad luck. Jack, small and quick, wins not by being stronger, but by being clever. He sneaks, he steals, he runs, he chops the beanstalk. The message is simple. You can't overpower the forces that loom above you, but you might be able to outsmart them. Now compare that to another famous giant from another rainy green land. Travel west to Ireland, to the legends of Fionn mac Cumhaill. In some tales he's a giant himself, in others a human hero who deals with giants, but in either case scale is fluid. Fionn can hurl rocks that become islands, toss clods of earth that land as the Isle of Man. One story says he built the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland as stepping stones to Scotland so he could confront a rival giant. Here the giant isn't a mindless monster. He's a culture hero, a builder, a trickster, yes, but also a protector of his people. He doesn't live in the clouds above a farm boy's world. He straddles the boundaries of land and sea, shaping the coastline itself. His size is not a threat to ordinary humans. It's a resource, something that can be deployed for the good of the community. Cross the ocean again, move forward in time, and you meet Paul Bunyan. Now the setting is North American logging camps in the 19th century. Endless forests, bitter winters, a working life that breaks the body. Out of that environment, lumberjacks begin telling stories about a man so big his footsteps create lakes, his camp is miles wide, his blue ox babe can drag entire forests in one go. Paul Bunyan isn't a man-eater. He's not even scary. He's a mascot for human labour at a superhuman scale, a way for exhausted workers to laugh at the impossibility of what's being demanded of them. If the logging companies want 1,000 trees cut in record time, well, fine. Just call him Paul. Same pattern as Jack's giant reversed. Instead of a huge being who controls your fate, a huge being who's on your side. Same impossible scale, opposite emotional meaning. Over centuries, something interesting happens. Many of the oldest giants in myth are terrifying. They swallow gods, hurl mountains, drown the world. But as time goes on, as societies become more settled, more urban, more used to controlling their environment, some of those giants soften around the edges. The Norse frost giants, the Jotnar, start out as primal forces of chaos and cold, older than the gods themselves. By the late sagas, some of them marry into the gods' families. They bargain, argue, form alliances. They become people. The Bible's giants shift, too, from primordial Nephilim, shadowy half-divine figures tied to ancient violence and flood myths, to individual warriors like Goliath, still frightening, but now just one very tall man in armour on a battlefield. By the time we get to European fairy tales written down in the 17th and 18th centuries, a whole spectrum has emerged. There are ogres who eat children, yes, but there are also giants who are simply grumpy landlords, or lonely castle dwellers, or overgrown shepherds. Their terrible size becomes almost comedic, something children can laugh at as well as fear. One way to think about this: early giants belong to a world where nature is overwhelming and unpredictable. Later giants belong to a world where nature is being fenced, farmed, measured, and taxed. As our control over the physical world increases, our stories start to ask a different question. What if something that powerful chose to be kind? Underneath all the variations, one theme runs strong. Giants are the shape we give to the wilderness itself. Go north, into the deep forests and mountains of Scandinavia. There you meet trolls. Not the little toy trolls with neon hair, but the old ones. Huge, ugly, slow, made of rock and earth and night. They live in caves, under bridges, in the high ranges where the weather turns without warning. Step into their territory without proper respect, and you might disappear. Trolls are not just big people. They are the mountain's temper, the forest's mood, the danger of being too far from the village when the sun goes down. When a rock formation looks eerily like a frozen family, there's a story. Trolls caught by the sunlight turned to stone, landscape explained by myth, wilderness given a face. Far to the south and west in the Basque country between Spain and France you find the Gentillac, enormous pagan giants who roamed the mountains before Christianity arrived. They threw huge stones from peak to peak, built dolmens and megaliths, taught humans how to farm. In some legends, the Gentillac disappear when a mysterious bright star, Christianity, appears in the sky. They retreat into the earth or leap into the sea, making way for a new faith and a new order. Here giants are literally the old world, the pre-Christian past. They stand at the boundary between wild mountain life and the emerging civilized valley communities. When people looked at ancient stone monuments whose builders they'd forgotten, it was easy, even comforting, to say, "The Gentillac did this, the giants who came before us." Cross again, now to Japan, and you encounter the Daidarabochi. These are not giants in a castle, not even giants on a mountain. They are so vast they are the landscape. A Daidarabochi can pick up entire hills to weigh them in his hands. The footprints he leaves behind become lakes. Some legends say he once rearranged the Japanese islands, lifting, shifting, dropping them back into the sea. With Daidarabochi the symbolism is laid bare. Mountains move, lakes appear, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis reshape the coastline with no warning. To live in such a place is to live under the constant awareness that your home can be changed overnight by forces far beyond you. Giving those forces a name and a body, Daidarabochi, doesn't tame them, but it makes them thinkable. In all these traditions, giants stand on borders, not just geographic ones, but conceptual ones. The edge of the forest, the foot of the mountain, the mouth of the cave, the line where ploughed field becomes scrubland, where well-lit streets give way to dark water. Cross that line and you enter giant country. Stories put giants there for a reason. They're warning signs in narrative form. Parents don't have to lecture children about hiking too far from the path or swimming in the deep part of the river. They can just say, "Don't go past that hill. That's where the giant lives." The rules of ecology, predators, floods, sudden storms, get turned into the rules of story. Don't wake what sleeps in the hills. Don't steal what belongs to the giant. Don't stay out after dark in troll country. Giants also mark the boundary between the everyday and the sacred. Many megaliths and solitary standing stones end up associated with giants, thrown by them, carried by them, used as their seats or graves. Those places are liminal zones, where the human world brushes up against something older, stranger, not fully understood. Saying, "A giant put this here," is another way of saying, "This place is different. Pay attention, walk carefully." And yet, for all this danger, we keep coming back to one kind of giant in particular, the gentle one, the Beth G. and Roald Dahl story, sipping dreams instead of blood, the Iron Giant in the animated film, built as a weapon but choosing to be a friend, Hagrid in Harry Potter, half giant, half outsider, soft-hearted, keeper of dangerous creatures, huge, powerful, but safe to love. Why do we return to this figure again and again? Part of it is wishful thinking. If there must be things in the world vastly stronger than we are, governments, corporations, storms, machines, we would rather imagine that at least some of them are on our side. The gentle giant is the fantasy of benevolent power, a giant who can lift you up to see the stars but will never drop you. Part of it is empathy turned upside down. Many children feel small, voiceless, pushed around by rules they didn't create. Putting those feelings into a giant who is clumsy, misunderstood, too big for the spaces built by others, lets us explore loneliness and exclusion from a new angle. The giant becomes the bullied one, the one who doesn't fit, the one who needs protection. And part of it might reach back to something very old in our species. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived alongside animals that, to us, would seem gigantic. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, aurochs. Most were dangerous, some were deadly. But sometimes, rarely, the powerful thing could also be a source of shelter or food or warmth. A whale carcass washed up on shore, a mammoth herd that could feed a band through a long winter. Power wasn't always an enemy. Sometimes it was a gift, if you approached it correctly, if you showed respect, if you learned its patterns. The gentle giant in modern stories is that same intuition, reshaped for an age of cities and screens. A way of saying, maybe not all vast forces are hostile. Maybe something enormous could choose kindness. So when you hear "Once upon a time there was a giant," know that you're hearing more than just a bedtime story. You're hearing echoes of mountains and storms, of old religions and lost builders, of anxious parents and daring children, of workers laughing in the dark to keep fear away. You're hearing humanity talking to itself about scale, about what it means to be small in a big world, and what it would feel like just for a moment to have a friend whose shadow is taller than men and taller than fear. And as you drift further into the night, remember, whether they're crushing bones, building causeways, or gently holding out a hand the size of a house, the giants in our stories are always doing the same thing. They're standing right on the edge, where our little human world ends and something vast and mysterious begins. By now, you've walked through the whole landscape. Real bones, real medical conditions, real tall people whose clothes still sit in museum drawers and whose names are written in parish records and hospital charts. And around them, like mist rising from the ground on a cold morning, the stories. Nephilim and Anakim, Cyclopes and ogres, titans chained beneath mountains, and gentle giants baking bread at the edge of the village. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean that almost every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and millennia, looked up at the world and said, in one way or another, there were giants here? Think back through the chapters. You've seen shepherds and farmers stumbling across huge fossilized bones they couldn't possibly explain. The thigh bone of an extinct elephant, the jaw of a mastodon, the skull of a dwarf elephant with a great round nasal opening that looked eerily like a single eye socket. To a world without paleontology, those weren't Pleistocene megafauna. They were proof, confirmation that the old stories were true. Titans had walked the hills. You've seen how rare, real, human gigantism can be. Tumours on the pituitary gland pushing the body past its normal limits. Children who grew until their hearts and joints could barely carry the load. You watch them become living legends in their own lifetimes, turned into sideshow acts and travelling wonders. Ordinary people with headaches and joint pain and loneliness, recast as monsters or marvels or half-remembered demigods. You've seen the hoaxes, plaster-petrified men buried and dug up to sell tickets, carved stone colossi planted in farm fields, newspaper sketches of 15-foot skeletons that no one ever photographed properly, no one ever catalogued, no one ever found again. You've seen how those hoaxes didn't kill the myth, they fed it. Because the point was never just the bones, it was the feeling. And underneath all of it, running like a quiet current, you've seen the same human habit play out over and over. We find something extraordinary. We don't fully understand it, so we wrap it in a story big enough to hold our awe and our fear and our questions. That's what giants are. They're not just about height, they're about scale. They are the way we talk about anything that feels too big to fit comfortably inside an ordinary human life. For early farmers, giants were a way to explain those impossible stones on the hill. Megaliths so large that even a crowd of villagers couldn't imagine dragging them across fields with ropes. So of course the stones were moved by someone more than human. Someone with longer strides and stronger hands. Someone whose day's work was the stuff of legends for everyone else. For storytellers around a winter fire, giants were a way to feel the size of the landscape. You live in a narrow valley, walk your whole life within a few dozen miles. The mountains beyond are bare and distant. You've never seen the world from their summits. You've never watched the sunrise from above the clouds. But you can imagine something that stands there effortlessly. A being that uses your tallest trees as walking sticks. A creature for whom your hardest journey is just a single step. For parents telling stories to children, giants are both comfort and warning. The friendly giant who protects the village, who is simple and kind and easily tricked, reassures you that power can be gentle. The man-eating ogre lurking in the hills warns you that the world beyond the hearth is not safe, that there are forces you cannot control, that wandering too far from home has consequences. In all of these, giant myths are doing something quiet but important. They're encoding memory. They're taking encounters with the unknown and turning them into something you can pass down. Maybe your ancestors really did see someone unusually tall wander into town one season, a trader from a far-off people, standing half a head above everyone else in the marketplace. Maybe they saw the bones of a mammoth eroding from a cliff and mistook it for a human who had once been unimaginably huge. Maybe they heard stories from a neighbouring culture about giant warriors that were in reality simply well-fed soldiers from a better-resourced kingdom, wearing taller helmets and heavier armour. The exact details don't survive. The precise height, the measurements, the medical explanation, the taxonomy of the fossil, those fade. What lingers is the feeling. There was a time before this time. There were beings before us who were bigger, stronger, stranger. The world used to be more. That feeling gets distilled into giants, a single powerful symbol you can use to say, the past was not small. And the symbol endures because it still speaks to us. Look at modern fantasy. The Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Attack on Titan, children's stories about gentle giants and superhero movies with city-sized enemies stomping through skyscrapers. Video games where you fight towering bosses whose hands are the size of your character's whole body. In an age of skyscrapers, cargo ships, suspension bridges, and deep space telescopes, you might think we'd be done with giants. The scale of modern life already dwarfs us. A single rocket booster is taller than any mythical giant ever was. But we still love them, because giants let us externalize the things that feel too large inside. A giant can be anything, a manifestation of an empire too big to fight, a metaphor for climate change looming and slow and world-shaping, a stand-in for grief, or trauma, or history itself. It's easier to picture something you can see the edges of, even if it's colossal, than it is to imagine a threat spread thin and invisible through your whole life. So we give it a body, we give it a face, we call it a giant, and then, in the story, we decide what to do about it. Befriend it, topple it, flee it, outwit it. Stories like that don't just entertain, they let our minds practice. Practice being small without being helpless. Practice living in a world where not everything centers on us. But there's a tension here. On one hand, we've spent this whole journey carefully peeling back the layers of the legend. We've looked at the fossils that inspired myths, the medical diagnoses that shaped the lives of real tall individuals, the forged skeletons that tricked newspapers and museum visitors. We've named the hoaxes, traced the errors, followed the threads of evidence where they lead. There is something deeply valuable in that. When you ask, where did this story come from? You respect your ancestors enough to treat them as real observers of a real world, not as gullible children. When you track a myth back to a mastodon bone or a pituitary tumour, you're not ruining the magic. You're discovering what they actually saw. You're glimpsing the same raw material that their imaginations had to work with. But if you go too far in that direction, if you insist that every story must be flattened into a simple single explanation, you lose something too. A legend is not a lab report. It's not trying to give you a GPS-accurate map. It's trying to give you meaning. It exaggerates to make a point. It distorts to make a feeling visible. It combines 3 different half-remembered events into one clean narrative, because the emotional truth is clearer that way, even if the timeline isn't. If you look at a story of giants and say only, well, that was probably just an elephant femur and a man with acromegaly, you've explained the spark, but you've ignored the fire. The real question isn't just, what did they see? It's, why did it matter so much that they retold it for 1,000 years? Careful inquiry doesn't have to kill wonder. It can deepen it. When you realize that ancient Greek sailors were probably finding fossilized bones of extinct animals in cave mouths and quarry walls, and that from those scattered bones they pieced together whole races of cyclopes and titans, that's not less magical than giants. It's more. It means they were doing paleontology without the word, reconstructing the deep past with nothing but their eyes, their hands, and their stories. When you learn that a medieval village's giant's grave is actually a jumbled pile of mammoth and rhinoceros bones, you don't have to sneer at the legend. You can stand there, in the same wind that touched their faces, and feel yourself become